Just a heads up for everybody here. And everyone should be able to see my screen here on the side. So we'll get started with today's talk on pruning cold climate wine grapes. And over here you can see an image. This is actually West Madison Agricultural Research Station, where I did my master's work and really fell in love with pruning more. So that's just an image of it in the wintertime. There were 3 different types of training systems there, so it was quite a variety of pruning opportunities. And I'd just like to acknowledge a few people. So I want to say thank you to John Toole, who many of you may be familiar with. John is somebody who has greatly influenced me in regards to my pruning practices, and I think he's influenced a lot of people in Minnesota. So I wanted to acknowledge him along with Jenny Toole as well. And thank you to the staff at the University of Minnesota Horticultural Research Center, along with the University of Minnesota Fruit Breeding Program, for helping to produce a lot of the grapes that we work with today. If you're looking for more in-person opportunities to learn about grape pruning, know that we do have one workshop coming up on March 23rd at Salem Glen Winery, located in Olmsted County in Rochester, Minnesota. Feel free to use this QR code if you are interested in joining for more in-person learning opportunity. And today, as I mentioned, we'll be covering a lot of information, kind of going, slightly into the background, talking about cold climate wine grapes, what it means to be pruning during the establishment years of training grapevines, understanding a little bit more about mechanics and different types of pruning. When do you use pruning? And we'll go over annual pruning in general, and then we'll have some takeaway points, and hopefully we'll have some discussion. But again, this webinar is being recorded for teaching purposes, so it is possible that it may run over. And any questions that are not answered today, if you have them in the chat, I will be using them to create a short article for our Fruit and Veg News newsletter. So feel welcome to keep using that chat, and hopefully we'll finish up at a good time and be able to answer some of those questions. For those who are not familiar with cold climate wine grapes, this is a talk on cold climate wine grapes. And so what are we talking about? For basically since the 1800s, actually, it's been a long time since various people throughout the Midwest have been breeding grapes, trying to achieve quality grapes that can survive winters in Minnesota. Because a lot of European wine grapes, which most people are familiar with, names like Merlot or Cabernet, tend to be less cold hardy and unable to survive winters in Minnesota. We do actually grow them here at the Horticulture Research Center, but we bury them every year. So it takes a lot of effort to keep them without winter injury. So at the University of Minnesota and other breeders throughout time have bred these 2 grapes together using traditional methods to create cold climate hybrid grapes. And here's just a few that you may be already familiar with. These have come straight out of the University of Minnesota breeding program. Other cultivars, I know somebody had mentioned Somerset in the chat room, and I should mention, Elmer Swenson was a person who actually dedicated a lot of time and helped the University of Minnesota breeding program with other grapes like Brianna, Edelweiss, vines like that. Tom Plocher is one other breeder who created Petite Pearl as well. So we do have some table grape cultivars that we have been working on. Somerset is kind of our one table grape co-release that we had done with Elmer Swenson, but we do have our own table grape cultivars that we are going to be releasing, a couple of which may be out within the next year. They've been sent to nurseries and are being propagated, and this is very exciting. Table grapes tend to have thinner skins. They do not have seeds. They have very different training systems. They tend to have more 3-dimensional training systems to protect those clusters because the quality of the fruit matters for fresh eating. So if you're interested in learning more about pruning table grapes and 3-dimensional structures, this will not be that talk today, but you will learn enough to be able to probably approach that type of training system from what we talk about. So let's get into talking about pruning here, which really just means to cut away. And in this context, we're talking about a branch or a stem. And why do we prune grapevines? Grapevines are normally going to be growing as woody vines that do not necessarily have a lot of form to them. The advantage of being a vine is that you can kind of grow into a better situation. You can grow towards the light. You don't necessarily have to be at the right place. So when you take something that isn't naturally going to have that much form to it, and you want to put it into a more contained setting, it takes a lot more effort to contain the vine and maintain that shape. And grapevines, as all plants do, they photosynthesize. So they're going to be photosynthesizing throughout the summer and pulling in those carbohydrates or making carbohydrates, pulling them into the plant, either sending them to fruit or other parts of the grapevine. So that could be shoots, woody tissue, roots, and that builds the structure of the grapevine. It also builds up reserves to help the vine survive the winter and to support next year's bud break. So many of you are probably familiar with the term terroir, which refers to the effect of a regional climate on a final wine juice or final wine product or grape itself. The other terminology that you may be familiar with is typicité. So that just is about how typical is a cultivar or is a specific wine to the cultivar. How much does a Marquette taste like a Marquette? So those two things kind of come together, right? Most people who are trying to achieve a wine that has that signature identity of being that wine, but is a little unique, right? And so the other thing that really comes into play and can influence all of this are canopy management techniques. And within that, pruning is one of those techniques that is going to be the first step in managing the canopy. And this is to allow for sunlight and airflow to get into the canopy. So our main goals with pruning, I'm going to be talking a lot about goals and achievements today and considerations, but the big North Star goal is to guide and contain a grapevine, guide its growth to form a healthy, balanced vine and a quality harvest. So you can kind of think about what that means throughout this presentations. There's a number of reasons to prune, right? So this kind of falls into why that all matters, right? So we're managing the vine size and shape, but we're also increasing airflow and sunlight. And that matters because that can impact the plant health. That can impact disease, as well as fruit quality when sunlight can actually get in there. Additionally, the buds that will be producing fruits for the following year are actually developing in the current season. So when you allow sunlight to get into the cluster zone, you're also allowing sunlight to reach the buds that are developing for the following year, which is healthy and good. So that can impact the actual fruit quality for future years. When you prune, you're going to be controlling how many shoots and how much fruit is on the vine. So we're contributing to the crop load as well. And as I mentioned, there is consideration to disease production within canopy management, but additionally, we always just want to be aware that we're preventing diseases while pruning just by being considerate of what we know is out in the vineyard and the temperatures at which we're pruning. So pruning grapes is a little unique from other crops. As I mentioned, we'll be talking about apples in a couple of weeks from now. And for those who come to the grape world from the apple world, pruning grapes is going to be a lot more intensive than pruning trees. And if you try to go from the grapevine world to the apple world, if you were to try to apply grape pruning that way, it'd be a little bit tricky. However, there's still going to be a lot of similarities in what cuts do. So that's still something to a good reason to learn about grape pruning if you're interested in in pruning other fruit crops. You'll still learn a lot. And then, yes, it's still unique from shrubs as well. And so here we have just a picture on the left of a grapevine before pruning. And then on the right here, we have a grapevine after pruning with buds that have already started to develop. We're getting close to leafing out here, but just to show you that we're really removing, and these are two different vines, but we really are removing about 90% of last year's growth. And that's just a close up to show you again what that looks like in that fruiting zone area here, which we'll begin to talk about in just a moment. Pruning is worthwhile. So you're going to see a lot of dormant vines in this talk, but it's all worthwhile because we're going to be leading up to harvest that next year. So keep that fruit in mind as you continue. So let's take a break here to learn a little bit more about grapevine anatomy for those who may be less familiar. Shoots, we'll start with the most basic anatomical structure of a grapevine, which are the shoots, and that's our current season's growth. It's actively growing. And as we get towards fall and we reach that point of acclimation into fall, those shoots are going to become woody. They're going to mature into what is known as a cane. And a cane is probably one of the most important anatomical parts that I want you to take home from today's talk. Canes are very important. So they're going to be what produce shoots that have fruit for the following season. And so canes and all those shoots are going to be coming from compound buds that are located at regions called nodes along the canes. And so here, just a little bit more detail for those who are less familiar. There's that nodal region, that region called a node on a growing shoot, which is still called a node on a cane that has matured. And that region will contain a leaf, typically. It can have a lateral shoot that emerges out of it. It has that bud that's developing for next year's fruit. So the clusters are even compact, developing inside of that bud. And it may also have a tendril on it. So here on the right, I'm showing you a picture, a diagram of a compound bud, which shows a primary bud in the center of the compound bud, which is the largest bud that exists and will create the largest shoot that also contains fruit. Grapes are unique because they also contain a secondary bud, and that secondary bud can also produce fruit, and it sort of acts as the backup for the primary bud. Most grapes have a tertiary bud as well. Some actually have more than 3 buds. That tertiary bud is another backup bud, does not contain fruit, but at least allows, if there is cold damage, it allows for the plant to continue to photosynthesis and survive the following year. So just to remember, each bud, which is a compound bud, right? Each of those compound buds has the potential to create a shoot that can grow a lot in one season. So multiple feet in one season. And I really want you to think about canes as being the building blocks of the semi-permanent structures. And I say semi-permanent because we are in Minnesota, so we deal with winter injury from time to time. But these are going to be the building blocks of your grapevines. So as I mentioned, the canes are the elongated, woody, mature shoots. Hold on here. Just admitting a few more people into our discussion here. Thanks for everybody who's joining us now. We are just starting to talk a little bit more about grapevine anatomy here. And we were just mentioning that canes are kind of like the building blocks. They're sort of like the Legos of grapevine anatomy. So canes can be, over time, if you leave them alone, they'll continue to mature year after year. And eventually they could become what is, what you can see here on this diagram. They can become the trunk, or they can become cordons eventually, which are kind of the arms of the vine. Eventually, as you start to develop spurs, which we'll talk about, those will get older and mature, and the older parts were originally canes. So it all kind of starts as a cane. And here I want to just show you the difference between a grape spur and an apple spur. I think this term can confuse people who generally are enthusiastic about fruit. So grape spurs are artificially made. Grape spurs are basically canes that are cut back to a certain bud count. This is very different than fruit trees, where apple spurs are actually branches that are naturally just compressed branches that contain a few leaves and fruits usually. So grape spurs are artificially made, and they can stack on top of one another. So you can see here in this region, we have a very old spur, and then we have a new spur that was cut below it. So again, here's another one where it's an old spur with a new spur, whereas this spur is just a 1-year-old spur where it was produced from a cane. So let's get into some details about how to prune. So there's a number of purposes as to why you're going to be pruning when you're in the vineyard. The first is going to be when after you've planted your grapevines and you are starting to train them to develop a trunk, the cordons, spur regions, etc. The second one, which is mostly what this talk is going to be about today, is annual pruning. So that's where we're setting the fruit load. We cannot let every bud break on a vine. The vine cannot support it, all of that fruit, and it cannot support all those shoots. So we have to basically reduce that every single year. And then there are times when you may want to be replacing grapevine parts or retraining a vine or extending a cordon. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And just to mention that summer pruning, so this is winter pruning, pruning when the plant is dormant, but summer pruning and other management techniques are also out there. You may have heard of hedging or skirting. You've probably practiced this if you're already working in your own vineyard. And then there's a number of other management practices such as shoot thinning and tucking shoots for vertical shoot position systems, cluster thinning, removing clusters to also adjust for the crop load, and then pulling leaves to expose clusters to the sunlight. So this is just one thing that we do. And here's a number of pictures of all of these different tasks. So we'll begin with training. Training is basically when we're selecting canes and pruning other ones that we don't want, but we're selecting ones that we do want to become permanent or semi-permanent structures such as trunks, cordons, and base spurs. So pruning is kind of nested into training, which is a part of full vine establishment, just helping to create a healthy vine from planting until maturation here. So that's kind of how it all nestles in together. And your goals when you're pruning during training are basically going to be that you want to be selecting healthy wood to become those permanent structures. You want to be keeping enough buds on a younger vine to support enough shoots and leaves to photosynthesize and create those carbohydrate reserves to help that vine establish its roots and stay healthy for years to come. And then you want to also be pruning away weak, unwanted wood along the way, cleaning up any lateral shoots that might be on these canes. We'll talk more about that. So what choices might you be making? You're going to be thinking about how many trunks you want per vine. Where do you want your fruit zone to be? Do you want to be harvesting like this? Do you want to be harvesting like that? And that may dictate a little bit about which training system you end up choosing for your grapes. So there are bivalent systems where there's 2 arms going out. There's split canopy systems where you have about 4 arms. There could be something else that you're working on personally. Grapevines can be trained in a lot of different ways. There's not really a wrong way to train a grapevine. There's just different things that happen when you train a grapevine in a certain way. So will you be spur pruning versus cane pruning? Let's dip into that. So here are 2 of the most common training system options. We have the high cordon system. Both of these have those 2 cordons, so 2 permanent or semi-permanent structures. And those systems are either going to be trained with their shoots upright, like the vertical shoot positioning system, or their shoots are going to be trained downward, like the high cordon here. And I have worked with high cordon systems. The tallest I've worked with was about 6.5 feet to 7 feet. That was too tall for me. I'm about 5'4". So again, think about the training system you want to work with. You may want to be thinking about fruit quality, but also your ergonomics and what's comfortable for you. And here are some of those split canopy systems. So we've got Scott Henry, which is a system that I've worked with. It's split vertically compared to the Lyre and the Geneva double curtain, which are split horizontally. And the Scott Henry, because it is split vertically, it can actually be retrained. You can take those other two systems and retrain them that way because you already have the same trellis to train them on, whereas the lyre and the Geneva double kern need three-dimensional training systems in order to work. And then we've talked about single canopies, split canopies, and then there's this concept of cane pruning versus spur pruning. And cane pruning is basically where every single year those canes are going to be producing shoots. They're going to be the arms producing the shoots that create clusters every year. Whereas spur pruning, you're going to have these regions that have canes coming out that are cut back, and those produce shoots that have clusters on them. And cane pruning can be advantageous in some regards because there is a concern for cordons as they get older. They may build up winter injury, etc. So if you're always freshly laying down canes, you can avoid that. However, we get cold damage on canes in cold climates. So you really need a good cane that has about 12 to 15 buds that are healthy. So hopefully, you can be rolling the dice a little bit when you try to go that method, but you can always grab multiple canes to train over as well and select them later on as well. So here, again, just a couple of diagrams showing the Guyot and the umbrella Niffen here, which are, you can kind of imagine those two original training systems, but instead of having those permanent arms, they do not. So what are we doing when we're pruning during training? So we're talking about from planting to about 4 years and beyond. I'm going to go over this section pretty quickly today. Again, this could be a whole talk. I've done whole talks on training, but we're just trying to help lead into the story of annual pruning here. So our first year, we're really going to be working on good trunk establishment. And for Vitis vinifera and previously, there were recommendations to really cut back your vines extremely, 2 to 3 buds to try to force vigor into those shoots. But we don't recommend doing that as much anymore because the more shoots that you let grow out, the more leaves you're going to have, the more photosynthetic activity you'll have, and the more energy you're going to be bringing down to help with establishment. So you may be pruning off, some weaker wood here to help select for good canes, but you might be leaving a few more buds than the 2 to 3 that were used to be recommended. Which canes do you select? What is a healthy cane? This is a great time to talk about that. So a healthy cane is going to have a color that is between about tan to brown. And if you were to scrape a little bit of the bark off, you would see green beneath it. Whereas an unhealthy cane would be probably a little bit more whiter in color, a little bit lighter. You can usually see when something is almost burnt out as a cane. But so we have what John Toole might call a Goldilocks cane in the middle there. And then we have a bull cane on the left. Bull canes are come from very vigorous shoots. So they have very long internodes, which means that your shoots and your spurs could be spaced very far apart, which is not necessarily advantageous. They also tend to be thicker, and because they're thicker, their cells are a little bit wider, which means that they don't super cool water as well, and they're more susceptible to winter injury. Water super cool as well, meaning that it can cool to lower temperatures without freezing when it's really, really tiny. So having these larger stems does not help with that. And then we have our wheat cane that's kind of on the right side here, that's on the opposite end of the spectrum, and it may have super short internodes. It's probably going to be a little bit whiter, more susceptible to winter injury because it just doesn't have the reserves. So you want to be finding that good or the healthy cane. Yeah. And here's just a picture showing you what some of the variations of cane sizes look like in a vineyard setting, where the one on the left side would definitely be a bull cane there that I would avoid. Okay, so we've hit the end of that year. Now we're really going to be, selecting for that trunk. Hopefully, if we've hit our fruiting wire, because that's the goal, right? You can't necessarily start working on your arms until you have actually gotten to the height where you want the arms to be going out. So if you are in a scenario where you haven't even, your vines just struggled to grow a lot, you may be repeating, that same training year. Otherwise, the second growing season is really going to be dedicated to growing out shoots that will eventually be laid down to become the arms of the vine, also known as the cordons. So here's what that might look like if you are going to be laying down those shoots by the end of the growing season. You can also do that during dormancy. And then just a heads up for those who may be less familiar with grapes, you may be so tempted to wrap shoots around a wire, but just refrain from doing this because as you can see here, this is a picture from Vineyard in Mazomanie, Wisconsin, actually. And this older vine had actually girdled part of itself by growing around the wire. So instead, what you can do is secure the shoot, and eventually you're going to probably be securing it with heavier measures when it begins to grow and get heavier because the fruit is going to be so heavy. So there's a number of different things that you can use to secure it. The most heavy duty ones are things like egg lock, which can be a little bit less fun to work with your fingers, or agar tie, which is a little bit more flexible. There's tube ties that can be cut at any length that you want. I really love rubber band ties, which you'll see at the top there. They're just really easy to work with. There's a variation in the brands that exist, and I don't really have a favorite, but it's just one of my favorite tools because you can reuse them, take them off, and they grow with the cordon. So that's why twine isn't recommended, because it doesn't necessarily expand very well, and it can also lead to girdling. So at the end of the growing season, oops. All right, so we tied down our canes here. And now we're going to be entering into our next season. So we're entering year 3, where we're going to be focusing on selecting canes to become the cordons. And once we've done that, and again, you can select 1 or 2 on each side, kind of see how they do and cut one off later. Just make sure you come back and do that and you're not necessarily gathering up too much older wood. And this is a year where you may do about a half crop on your vine. The previous years, you've probably taken off your crop, but by the end of the growing season, you're going to be starting to do your first set of spurs. So you can see here that there's a lot of woody canes growing out of those fresh 2-year-old cordons at this point. And here's a picture of what that might look like in real life. Again, once you get out into the field, things can look a little bit different than textbook. And here's a scenario where you can see one side was ready to become, to start being spurred, and the other side needed a little bit more help. So I was actually laying down a cordon on one side while the other side was kind of ahead in training. And that's totally fine. That's kind of just the reality of how some of this goes. So we're winter 3 and 4. Here we are, we're cutting back all these new spurs. And for this 4th growing season, this is usually going to be the first time when you're going to be having a full crop on your vine. And by the end of the growing season now, you're going to be having these 3-year-old cordons and these older spurs here with the shoots, with the canes coming out. So this is going to be our first time where we're now entering annual pruning. So now the practice is not just to cut back every cane, and I'll mention too, right, that when we were doing that initially, we were hoping to have canes kind of spaced apart about a fist width apart from each other. But now we're going to be cutting back some canes while we're fully removing other canes. And the goal is going to be to have that same bud count as we did that, perhaps as we did it that previous year, but mostly you're going to want to be getting to a set number of buds either per vine or per linear foot of canopy. So we'll get into that here. So here we are, annual pruning. We're trying to contain the vine and reduce the shoot count by removing some canes and by cutting other canes back. So when you remove a branch or you remove a shoot, right, that's called a thinning cut, which a lot of apple growers are familiar with. So you're practicing thinning cuts with some canes. Other canes, you're practicing what is called a heading cut, where you're just cutting it back to a certain bud count in order to stimulate the growth of those buds to take over. So we know that each cane has the potential to make many shoots. We really want to have a contained, healthy, structured vine that can ripen all of the fruit that it produces. And we also know that overly dense canopies can lead to shading, higher disease incidence, poor ripening. They also impede pesticide from getting into the canopy. So even if you have a good spray program, it still is going to help with that aspect as well, along with helping expose those buds to create fruit for the following growing season. So here we are. Where do grapes lie kind of on the scale of pruning fruit crops? They're pretty intensive. And this is sort of a subjective scale here, right? But fall bearing raspberries are probably more intensive above that. Same with elderberry if you're mowing them back every year. But grapes are pretty intensive, right? We're moving about 90% of last year's growth. So again, here are those two concepts I'm going to be keep saying where we're reducing some canes to that healthy desired bud count, which is going to be about 2 to 4 buds. And then we're removing other canes completely. And we're going to make sure that we're leaving enough space, enough spurs and buds to avoid undercropping the vine, which could lead to a lot of excess growth of shoots that we don't want, or overcropping, which can lead to stagnating fruits, fruits that are stalling fruits that just don't ripen very well. Looks like one of my pictures did not get here, but this was just a visual representation showing you that this picture on the left would be where we're reducing a cane to a spur. So we're going to be cutting it about a 1/2 inch above that final bud. And when that cane is upright, that's when you want to have a diagonal cut. If you have shoots that are pointing downward like this, rainwater is not necessarily going to be pooling like if they're upright. And so when I was learning how to prune, the concept was always to cut diagonally. But this does create more exposure of the pruning wound overall. So if you don't have to do a diagonal cut, you don't want to. So only if you really have very upright shoots does that diagonal cut really start to matter more. And then with tools, you just want to make sure that your tools are sharp, they're clean, and you know the right tool for the job. Oh, okay, I guess there was an animation there. Surprise. All right. So our goals for pruning, I'll mention here, and we'll talk a little bit about tools as well. Our goals are to prune to a specific bud count, as I mentioned. This is typically going to be about 6 to 8 buds. You can also prune to have a certain number of buds per vine. If you only have a few grapevines that you're working with, that works out pretty well. Otherwise, it becomes too tedious. And it's just great to, if you know your hands and you can make that foot with your hands, you can kind of just start to space everything with your mind. And of course, you want to be zooming out as you do that because there's a whole vine and there's going to be variation throughout that vine. So 6 to 8 buds per linear foot. You want to encourage optimal spur spacing. As I mentioned, that fist length is about ideal. And the angle, right? So you want kind of more upward facing spurs for upright systems, whereas you'd want more downright facing spurs for downward systems. And you want to be making them from healthy wood, as we already covered. And you need to be able to look at a vine, or you'll want to look at a vine and kind of recognize, does this vine need to be rejuvenated, or is there winter damage? All of that. So these are kind of our goals to assess all of these things. So here's our pruning tool detour that we will go on for a moment here. Starting with talking about pruning shears. So pruning shears work very well. They're pretty short. I should have brought mine over here. I've got mine on my desk over there. But they're just going to be your basic tool that you're going to be using to prune back canes. They also work on a little bit larger wood. So if you have smaller spurs, this can also work. And there's a lot of variation and different pruners that are out there. Their blade materials can vary, whether they're coated with something or not coated with something. How well can they be sharpened? How strong are they? Are they, are you going to clip a wire accidentally with them? Or is the wire going to dent into your pruners accidentally if you intercept a wire? Watch out for wires when you're pruning, all of that. How does it feel in your hand? What is the ergonomics of that? So one thing that, especially if you're pruning acres and acres of grapes, I always recommend kind of like training, using tools to train before you get out there. It's a lot of repetitive movement. So you want to make sure that if you're going to be pruning a lot, that you have good practices, good handles, and good gloves as well. And then there's just a lot of different types. So you have your traditional manual ones. I've got the Falcos up here, which are pretty popular and quality. And then we also have ratcheting ones, which allow you to make a cut and then another cut and another cut. So you're not trying to just make a giant squeeze all at once. There are electric pruners, which are basically a button that goes and then it cuts it off. And then there's pneumatic pruners as well, which are similar to electric. They're usually a little bit more expensive, or a lot more expensive than electric pruners are. You want to know the capability of the branch cutting size for your pruners. And then there are also different models of pruners that of the blades where they will either hit the bottom part of the pruning shears, and that's known as an anvil blade, or they will bypass the bottom of the pruning shears, and that's called a bypass shear. And so bypass shears are known to not pinch branches quite as much, which I'm not sure exactly if that's research based or not, but it is something that people do favor. And there are, we'll talk more about this with loppers, but there are lopper styles that actually do have, it's kind of something in between where it looks like an anvil blade, but it actually has a little bit of capacity to bypass at the bottom. So just pay attention to what's out there before you order something. Going on to talk more about pruning loppers, when I mentioned those 6.5 foot tall canopies, I was definitely using loppers on that. I did not have a trailer and I was kind of out there on my own. So that was an instance where I was using loppers for full-on pruning. However, this shouldn't be the case if you set yourself up to have a good height that works well for you. But loppers, some other things to pay attention to, again, they're going to vary based on their blade material, whether they're that anvil blade, bypass blade, or somewhere in between. Think about the handle length. Some of them have extendable handle lengths as well, which is a little less important for grapevines unless they're super tall. There are ones that do ratchet, so that's something to pay attention to. And then just think about the weight. So if you were in that circumstance where you were pruning very tall vines, it gets heavy when you're holding them constantly like that. Another QR code here for you. This is just an article that many of you may have seen on UMN Fruit and Veg News talking about caring for pruning tools. So perhaps you're replacing some vines, or you're doing something where you need to use a pruning handsaw. It comes in hand every now and then, and it can be helpful for cutting out old wood. But pruning handsaws, I don't have a picture of here, but they tend to have pretty large teeth. They're a little bit more crescent shaped, typically, and yeah, there's just not quite as much variability there, but they can be helpful. And overall, just knowing, if you are working with larger wood, knowing how to use your own weight to reduce the amount of pressure that you're putting on the plant itself. So you can kind of lean in, cut, and that can help sometimes. Few more considerations. So we talked about the pruning cut as well. We've talked about cane selection. We want to be removing any branches or trunks that were diseased, or any fruits that mummified or desiccated in the vineyard. And you'll want to, typically people will burn those prunings. You want to also think about the weather and temperatures. So there is a little bit of speculation about this. From today's standpoint, we're mostly going to be talking about your own comfort. When I first started pruning, mostly people would warn you about pruning too early, but there is a little bit of speculation on that, and that grapevine buds may be able to tolerate more colder temperatures and may not be as affected. But again, this is really going to be dependent on where you live, the weather conditions, how acclimated the vine is to winter. There's a lot of factors that go into it. So basically, some of the best times to prune are going to be late in February, maybe this February. It's been a little trickier because it's been pretty darn cold. But March can be a really great time to prune. And even parts of April can work out well for pruning, just making sure that the temperatures are not getting too much above 50 degrees where you can have a higher risk of trunk disease introduction. So wind chill matters very little. As we all know, the wind chill temperature tends to be much colder. Absolute air temperature is what impacts grapevine survival. But with that said, the wind does impact the ability for pruning wounds to heal. So if you know that you're going to be hitting a super windy day the next day and it's going to get really cold and windy, this is where that risk of desiccation, of drying out really can happen, which can delay healing and cause issues. How windy is too windy? I don't have an answer for that, but it's just something to kind of think about. I have two slides about practical tips. The first one is thinking about buds. So those compound buds are so important. And if you're working with a system like vertical shoot positioning, your shoots or your canes are going to be tangled up in the wires. Um, and and so you're going to want to be mindful. If you're pulling anything out, for example, that might become a cane to lay down, be mindful to not just like pull it out because you may end up damaging buds along the way. So just be a little bit careful when you're doing that. Once the buds begin to swell, if you happen to be pruning after buds swell, or tying canes at that time, that's when you want to be really careful because they're going to be super delicate and you can accidentally rub a bud off and it's like, no, that was supposed to be my spur. So just be a little mindful of that. Here's my safety tip. As I was starting one of my workshops last year, I was very glad that I was wearing glasses because very quickly, one of my neighbors had pulled a chute down and it kind of whacked my sunglasses, right? So canes are known for their whipping motion, right? They're very fluid and they can kind of put you at risk sometimes. So just make sure that you've got two eyes, just two. So just protect them when you're out there. And then again, cane selection for creating spurs. We talked about what is a good cane, but in this circumstance, um, you know, okay, so we're going back to talking about the bull cane here briefly, but we'll also talk about directionality. So this will be an instance, right? So I mentioned that when we're pruning, we're going to be removing some canes completely while reducing others down to a certain bud count. Here I am at a spur region. And I have that old 2-year-old spur, which has that bark that's kind of rippling off a little bit. And out of it is this giant bull cane. The bull cane is higher than this other shoot that's been emerging out of the right. So it's higher up and it's also a bull cane. I'm not going to choose that one to become reduced. I'm going to get rid of it. And then I'm going to reduce the shoot next to it. And that's how I chose my spur in that circumstance. Additionally, you'll want to think about directionality. So here, the picture on the left shows another spur region, and it's got two different canes that I could select from. The lower cane in this circumstance is kind of jutting out pretty more horizontally. So I could really choose between these two. I'd have to zoom out to tell which one of these was going to work best. But just recognizing in this circumstance, you'd really have to kind of zoom out to decide which one. But in some cases, you may want the more upright one. In some cases, the more sideways one may work. And you'll see that picture on the right also kind of shows you that circumstance as well, where I would definitely choose the upper cane in that circumstance and get rid of the lower cane, or just shorten it down to one bud. So there's the cutting points. Gone, reduced. And then sometimes you have something just growing completely in the opposite direction. This shoot is growing completely in the opposite direction, and it's also just not a great cane, not a good candidate for this spur. So I would get rid of that. And here is another example of a circumstance where you have your 3-year-old cordon, and then you have a 2-year-old spur, you have this 1-year-old cane coming out of here, and then you have another 1-year-old cane. But what is this? This is actually a lateral shoot that came out. And that lateral shoot is not what I want to be producing into a spur region. So I would never, I personally would not produce a spur out of a lateral shoot. And then here we go again. This is just another example of where you could be reducing spur creep and just making a few decisions. But I wanted to show you this here where this is a very weak candidate for spur pruning. So you can tell, right? Just looking at that, if you were to push on that, it would probably just break and fall over. And now we get to the point where we're going to talk a little bit about the spur life cycle. So here we are, year 3. We all came to that earlier in the talk where we were going to start growing out the shoots from our new cordon, and we're going to have 2 different circumstances starting at year 4. So we went through that season. Now we're at year 4 here. We cut it back and we've got 2 shoots that have grown out. So the following year is when we start making decisions. And I'm going to show you just a few scenarios here if I always choose the upper cane versus the lower cane. So scenario 1, always the upper cane. Scenario 2 is always the lower cane. Here it is at year 5. Here it is at year 6. Notice the 2 at the bottom. Notice how scenario 1, it's creeping up. Scenario 2, it's staying compact. Year 7, it's creeping even longer. And for the first scenario, and for the second scenario, it's staying compact. So that's just again to show you what you can anticipate year after year. It can be extremely challenging to theoretically talk about pruning grapes. So I'm hoping that these diagrams help. Thinking about training systems, again, as I mentioned, I was like, you can make a spur between 2 to 4 buds. Well, how do you know how many buds you want to make out of your spur? The vertical shoot positioning system tends to have fewer buds per spur because it has something called strong apical dominance. And this concept, if that kind of goes in and out, just remember that long spurs on vertical shoot positioning systems can suppress the growth of those lower buds. So we don't necessarily want to suppress growth of lower buds because that also causes that old spur to creep. It creates that blind wood on the spur. So they tend to be a little bit shorter than the high wire cordon. That's the take home message here. But not everything has to be exact. There's going to be variation. Some spurs might be a little bit longer. Maybe one's a 5 bud spur. It's okay. And then this is the practice of double pruning here. So here it is before and after, and this is something, again, if you're thinking about pruning a little bit earlier in the season, you can practice this where you're going to be pruning back longer canes and then come in and do detailed pruning. This is also a good option if you know some people who have less experience but still want to participate. They can help do this earlier pruning, clear out all the shoots, or it could be lower shoots or shoots on a vertical shoot positioning system, and get all that brush out of there. And then if you are in a place where maybe you have a little bit more understanding or you know someone who does, they can come in there and easily come back and just do some of those detailed pruning. And this is just your grapevine throughout the season. Once again, let's remember we're producing fruit here. Winter, spring, summer, and then we have harvest at the bottom. And I just wanted to throw this in here for anyone who's here doing more landscaping. This is not necessarily a landscaping talk, but the concepts still apply, right? You may have multiple trunks. You may have, multiple older structures growing across the top of a pergola or something like that. But you're still going to be practicing pruning. You're still going to be, those canes are still going to be producing fruit. You're still going to want to prune those back. Perhaps you're taking out trunks every now and then, looking for old wood, all of that. So it can still apply to that. And here we are in the next section, which is kind of a little bit of storytelling. Hopefully this is bringing a little bit of humor to the hour here. But this is a character called the Don't. And this whole section is called Don't Prune How the Don't Does. So the don't goes out and prunes, and we're going to just kind of say avoid these practices, generally speaking, right? These are all guidelines, so there's not really a hard no, but you'll see what you can always just kind of see what happens when you do certain things. So let's see what the don't does. The don't goes out to prune at the vineyard. The scenario is all canes are pruned back into spurs, a mature grapevines. What could happen if you prune back every single cane into a spur? Well, we talked about this, that basically you'd likely be overcropping your vine, leading to it producing more fruit than it can handle and having a vine that's, just not able to ripen all of that fruit. So the solution is to select some canes to become spurs, again, either on top of older base spurs or to replace a base spur while removing other canes unless they're needed for another reason. The don't goes out to prune in the vineyard. The scenario is when small weak canes are the only option to create spurs, they're pruned back into a 2 to 4 bud spur like a healthy sized cane. Similar bud count makes sense. That's kind of what I told you to do when you're making a spur. But how well can these spurs support shoot and fruit growth? Probably not a lot. So the smaller the spur is, the less carbohydrate reserves it has in it, the less likely it's going to be able to support good fruit growth. So there's a few things that you could do in this situation. One of those things that you could do is to prune back those weak canes to single buds to increase the shoot vigor. And then you could even remove the fruit that year. And this is just what that looks like. So here was a cane that was really pretty weak. I cut it back to a single bud, and you can see that that single bud started to break, but we also have some adventitious buds, or some dormant buds that broke as well. Here's our next scenario. The don't goes out to prune in the vineyard. The scenario is that multiple vines are pruned linearly from one end of the vine to the other without backing up and zooming out. So you're kind of just doing the eat the corn thing. What could absolutely happen when you prune this way? Well, I think everyone does this at some point where you just get so zoomed in and you're kind of just going, and then you zoom out, you're like, oh, I like cut off something that I needed, or I didn't realize that there was this blank section, and I probably could have made up for a little bit of that by pruning differently over here. So, right, how we prune in one section of the vine is impacted by what the vine looks like overall. So the solution is to look at the whole vine or a whole region of a vine while you're pruning to maintain your vine bud count or your linear bud count. So I will practice zooming in and zooming out. The don't goes out to prune in the vineyard. And I'm going to say we have about 4 minutes to noon here just for anybody who needs to take off. This will probably end about 1:10 or so. So if you want to stay on, feel welcome to, but I just wanted to make sure that folks who need to take off at the 1 o'clock hour were aware of that. So here's our scenario is that vines are pruned without any assessment of grapevine winter injury, including assessing bud viability. Vines are pruned without accounting for necessary bud count adjustment. How might this affect this year's crop? And what does this mean? We haven't even started talking about this, right? But we're in Minnesota or maybe the upper Midwest. Wherever you are, you're working with cold climate grapes and your region is probably pretty cold, which means that there's an opportunity for some of the buds to get damaged. And so usually we will kind of look at those buds. So instead of giving you a solution, we're kind of going to go into this whole topic here about replacement. So what happens when you have winter injury or disease happens or some other management leads to older vine parts having blind wood or you have bud damage, things like that. You may need to be replacing spurs, cordons, or trunks. And I'll start by saying, even though we know winter injury happens, grapevines also need the winter. So they need a certain amount of cold in order to functionally start breaking and developing and breaking bud the next growing season. So they need the cold. They're temperate fruit crops, but they can get injured. And that winter injury susceptibility varies a lot. And so we have different USDA hardiness zones, which is based off of your extreme winter temperature. But then there's also just your own vineyard climate, the mesoclimate, which it sometimes is called. And do you have within your vineyard, do you have any low spots? Do you have any landscape that could be creating air, cold air pooling in? What is the cold tolerance of the cultivar that you're working with? And then kind of thinking about the level of that acclimation of the vine with the winter temperature. I won't be getting into this today, but at some point I'll probably be writing an article about Cornell's new webpage, which tracks acclimation of grapevines throughout the dormant season, and it's very exciting. So stay tuned if that's something you're interested in. Typically, so again, generally, the buds that are furthest or distal away from the base cordon are going to be most sensitive to winter injury. And that's why typically you would not want to prune too early, or if you did prune, you want to prune long to allow those other buds at the tip to take the fall for, the buds that you actually want to keep for that season. And here are just a few photos showing winter injury on grapevine buds. So assessing bud viability and winter injury before and while annual pruning. One way to do this is to take cane samples from the vineyard before pruning to check for bud injury. And that can inform how you want, if you want to leave more buds. So if you have more bud damage, you're more likely to leave extra buds, which if you end up having excess shoots, you can always thin them off early in the growing season, but that gives you that insurance. So if you're looking for a video to watch, this is from the University of Minnesota. Annie Claude created this video talking a little bit about winter injury in the vineyard. So if you want to check that out, know that it is available on our Small Farms YouTube channel. Additionally, there are times where winter injury can be so bad that it kills a vine down to the ground. Uh, Thankfully, the vines we work with are not grafted. And, in this case, it's kind of a reason to not find it's a reason to not pursue grafting in some regards, because when vines are grafted and they die down to the ground, the cultivar that grows back up is not the cultivar that you want to be growing. So in this case, we are not working with grafted vines. So the vine that grows back up is actually the vine that you want to be growing, which is really great. So we do have this advantage to retrain vines if we need to. But here again, maybe it's not your whole vine, but maybe you get some damage in your cordon. So this is from that video that Annie had created, and she's showing a vine where there's a lot of canes that are being pushed close to the neck of the trunk. And it's doing that partly because there's so much dead wood along the rest of the vine. And this is a great opportunity where the vine is almost like trying to lean its canes out there, saying, just train these out and maybe replace that cordon. We'll talk about that in a moment. But here's that third scenario where you may need to replace a spur that's either creeping up too tall and taking up too much of the canopy space, or it's just getting old in general and starting to produce less and less canes. In this scenario, we had some latent buds that did break and become shoots at the base of that spur. Those latent buds exist in older wood, and they can remain for a number of years, but they're kind of these insurance buds that can break. And when they do break and they're break near an old spur, you can keep those even if they're not going to produce fruit that year. It's a great way to start to plan to remove older spurs. And here we go again, just showing what that might look like on a high cordon system. So here I've got that 4-year-old cordon, 3-year-old spur coming out of it, along with a cane that broke sort of at the base. And then I have a 2-year-old spur and 2 1-year-old canes coming out. So if I wanted to replace that whole spur, I could replace it with the 1-year-old cane at the base, or I could choose to replace it with, one of the canes coming out of the 2-year-old spur. It's really up to you. And then, similarly speaking, retraining, extending, and filling in spaces from time to time. Grapes are so versatile. Again, those canes are kind of like Legos. You can sort of do what you want to with them, including filling out the cordon if it's not quite reaching the length you want, or even parts of the cordon before the end of it. This is an example where a grower was retraining a vine to try to get a higher canopy height to avoid frost damage in the spring, which is why I was pruning vines that were 6.5 feet. The problem was that was in Springfield, Missouri, and they did not have the frost susceptibility that we have here. So in this case, even if they were, I don't think these were at 6.5 feet, but I think they pushed them up to probably about 6 feet, and this made sense. I've got the don't here just because you can see that there are those laterals coming off of that cane there. And so that may be something that you don't necessarily want to be doing there. But you can see how versatile it is. Be nice to have an after picture. This is actually at Wollersheim Winery. And here we got a couple of pictures. One is just showing an elongation of a cordon, whereas the other one is showing a cordon where it's not being elongated, but there was a lot of blind wood at the beginning near the neck of the cordon, so that's being replaced. And we just got a few more slides here for those of you who are still on. So if you are doing that long pruning, excuse me, you'll just want to be careful not to prune off anything that you want to be using to extend your cordon, because that can happen. And even if you are pruning, you can accidentally prune something off. So again, zooming out can be really helpful. And these are just a couple of funky circumstances. One is kind of a back trained cordon, which is not going to be helpful in the long run, even though it's making up space for space right now. But you can see that there's still that other cane candidate, this one right here, that could be laid down eventually to replace this whole other part if needed. And then here, you can kind of see how this is hooped up. Instead of just trying to push this down, you can actually take this little piece of tapener or anything that's fastening it off, and then you can start to manipulate and kind of work with that so that it comes to a place where it's laying out in a linear way. And that way, again, all of the xylem, the phloem, the vascular system of the plant, it does respond when it's kind of bent a little bit more. So if there's any way that you can kind of work with that cane to lay it down flat without forcing it, just play with it a little bit, that can be really helpful. So again, we talked about our 2 achievements, but if we really add replacement and renewal on here, we're going to be, when we're annual pruning, we're going to be looking and trying to identify any parts of our vines that might have blind wood that could be renewed. We're elongating parts, maybe filling in parts of the grapevine. But if you're just new to pruning, all I want you to remember is that whole process of removing some canes completely and reducing others to that 2 to 4 bud count. The take-home messages from today's talk, basically remember that grapevines produce fruit from shoots that develop from buds on canes. Canes are the building blocks of grapevines. They are the living Legos that create all the different structures. And pruning helps improve and contain vine shape and improve the canopy microclimate, which can lead to a higher chance of improved fruit quality. There's multiple circumstances for when we prune, including training, annual pruning, rejuvenation, along with retraining and extending. And I just really encourage you all to follow some practices, set some goals for yourself, explore and take note about what happens throughout the growing season. Take good care of your body while you're pruning, good care of your body before pruning, all of that, and stay warm. So with that, I just want to say thank you to you all today for being here. And I'm leaving you with this picture of a very tiny wasp nest that I had found at some point on a grapevine. So thanks everyone for being here today. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll stick around for a few minutes here as well. So thank you.
Madeline, there is a question in the chat.
Yes.
So a latent bud that creates a shoot will not be fruitful in the first year, but will be in the second?
That's correct. So typically, Those buds, it's possible for them to have fruit on them, but they typically will not have fruit on them. So that first year that that latent bud breaks out, it's just kind of growing, which is nice because you actually, if you're developing a spur, you don't really want it to have fruit because remember, fruit's going to be draining, asking for energy. So it actually works really well when that happens, I think. Thanks, Drew.
Would you like me to put the link to the handout in the chat?
Sure. Yep. So we do have a handout here. Drew's going to put that in the chat for anybody who wants to check that out. This is something that's pretty complimentary to today's presentation. And then Tom was asking about Itasca being more fruitful from the fourth and seventh bud. We can talk more about cane pruning. I actually, I know John Toole did like a very short interview with Fritz Westover last year, and talked a little bit about cane pruning. So I think, yeah, it'd be something maybe we could invite John to talk a little bit more about that. I'll see if he might be interested. At least I can, Tom, we might be able to get him to answer that. So thank you for that question.
And another question is, will this be available later online?
Yep, so this presentation is being recorded right now, and this will be posted on our Small Farms YouTube channel. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. Oopsies.
And there is one more question in the chat.
Okay, sure.
Great presentation, Madeline. I have no idea how to pronounce Edelweiss.
Oh,
Edelweiss.
that's Edelweiss. Yep, no worries.
Oh, is 20 years old and grows over
Wow.
an arbor. How should I rejuvenate it? Can I just cut a huge chunk of the growth off the top?
Abby, if you have a picture of it and you're able to email me, that would be helpful. It really just kind of depends on how much old wood there is, there and whether or not you're getting new growth from the base of the vine. So yeah, those arbors, they can look a little bit different. You could take off a huge chunk, but w where you're cutting that off from, I would want to know kind of what that region looks like. So, yeah, if you want to reach out to me, my email, throw that in there. That is something that is always an option. Sometimes it can take a little bit for me to get back to you, but happy to do some individual questions that way as well. All right. And I think with that, it seems like we're all probably in a good place here. And thank you all again for coming. I'm going to be stopping the recording here